U.S.-Saudi relationship is built on one sentence, negotiated in February 1945, on a U.S. Navy destroyer in the middle of the Suez Canal. America guarantees Saudi security. Saudi Arabia guarantees America's oil supply. Everything that followed, the arms sales, the diplomatic protection, the petrodollar system, the wars fought and the wars not fought, flows from that one sentence. It was agreed between two men who had never met before, who spoke no common language, and who were both dying. Roosevelt had less than 2 months to live. Ibn Saud had just been told his eyesight was failing permanently. They understood each other perfectly. King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, known in the West as Ibn Saud, was the founder of modern Saudi Arabia. He had unified the Arabian Peninsula by conquest over 3 decades, establishing the kingdom in 932. He was a man of profound religious conviction and extraordinary political intelligence. And he had something Roosevelt needed desperately: control over the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, confirmed by American geologists working for Aramco in the late 1930s. Roosevelt had arrived at this meeting knowing precisely what he wanted. He had sailed across an ocean to ask for it in person. The meeting lasted several hours. Roosevelt, confined to a wheelchair, conducted the entire conversation through interpreters. Ibn Saud was reportedly moved by Roosevelt's disability. He offered him one of his own personal wheelchairs as a gift. Roosevelt, in turn, promised to consult Ibn Saud personally before making any decisions about Palestine. He also promised American military protection for the Saudi kingdom against any threat. In exchange, Ibn Saud confirmed American oil companies' access to Saudi petroleum. The arrangement was not signed as a formal treaty. It was a personal commitment between two heads of state, sealed with a handshake over the Great Bitter Lake. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, 59 days after the Quincy meeting. Harry Truman, who succeeded him, had not been at the meeting and was not briefed on its specifics. What he inherited was a commitment he hadn't made, to a relationship he didn't fully understand, built on an oil dependency that was only going to grow. Truman's handling of the relationship would be far less careful than Roosevelt's. He would support the creation of Israel in 1948 against State Department advice, a decision that immediately strained the Saudi commitment and set the terms for the next 70 years of Middle Eastern tension. The Quincy meeting established a template that American presidents would follow, with variations, for the next 80 years. Secure the oil, protect the regime, manage the contradiction between American democratic values and the rulers those values required. Every U.S. president from Truman through Biden has operated within the architecture Roosevelt built on that destroyer in February 1945. None of them have fundamentally renegotiated it. And the reason is simple: the oil was always there, and the dependency was always growing. To understand how America became the dominant power in the Middle East, you have to understand how Britain stopped being one. Britain emerged from WWII technically victorious, but economically broken. It had spent its foreign currency reserves, liquidated its overseas investments, and taken on enormous debt to the United States through the Lend-Lease program. The British Empire that had controlled Middle Eastern oil since WI was running on borrowed money and borrowed time. The 1956 Suez Crisis would make that visible to the entire world. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the waterway through which 2/3 of Europe's oil moved. Britain and France were furious. They secretly colluded with Israel to manufacture a pretext for military intervention, invaded Egypt, and prepared to retake the canal by force. What they had not done was consult Washington. Eisenhower was enraged. He threatened to sell us holdings of British government bonds, which would have collapsed the pound sterling. Britain backed down within days. It was the most public demonstration in history of who was now in charge. The Suez Crisis confirmed what had been true since 1945. The United States was the new guarantor of Middle Eastern order. But where Britain had maintained control through direct colonial administration, mandates, military bases, appointed governors, America used a different instrument. It used money, intelligence, and the implicit threat of withdrawal. The CIA became the primary instrument of American Middle Eastern policy in the 1950s, and the first major deployment of that instrument, the operation that defined the CIA's role in the region for the next 30 years, was Iran. Iran in 1951 had done something the oil system was designed to prevent. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and placed Iranian oil under state control. Britain imposed an economic blockade. The Eisenhower administration newly in office in 953 and receptive to British arguments about Soviet influence, authorized the CIA to act Operation Ajax, run jointly with British intelligence, was executed in August 1953. Within 11 days, Mossadegh was removed, the Shah was restored, and the oil concessions were restructured, this time including American companies at 40%. The British monopoly was broken. American companies moved in. The 1953 coup in Iran is one of the most consequential covert operations in history. Not because it succeeded, but because of what it produced. It installed a Shah who became increasingly authoritarian and dependent on American support. It created a deep, permanent Iranian resentment of both Britain and the United States. And 26 years later, that resentment became the Islamic Revolution, which created the Iran that confronts America and the world today. $2 million and 11 days in 1953. The bill has been paid in every decade since. While the CIA was managing crises, a different kind of American operation was underway in Saudi Arabia, and it was transforming a desert kingdom into the most strategically important nation on earth. Aramco, the Arabian-American oil company, had discovered oil in Saudi Arabia in commercial quantities in 938. By the late 1940s, the scale of what lay beneath the Saudi desert was becoming clear. The Ghawar field, discovered in 9948, would turn out to be the largest conventional oil field ever found. A single field in a single country, containing more oil than most nations had in their entire territory. The relationship between Aramco and the Saudi government in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a microcosm of everything wrong with the Seven Sisters system. The Americans extracted the oil. The Saudis received a fixed royalty. The profits flowed overwhelmingly to the American companies. Saudi officials, watching what Mossadegh was attempting in Iran, began making their own demands. In 19,950, a renegotiated agreement split profits 50-50 between Aramco and the Saudi state. It was a significant improvement, but it was still the companies that kept the books. And in the oil business, keeping the books means controlling the outcome. The transformation of the U.S.-Saudi relationship from an oil transaction into a strategic alliance happened gradually through the 1950s and accelerated after the 1973 oil embargo. The key architect on the American side was Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford. After 1973, Kissinger understood that the embargo had revealed a structural vulnerability. If the Saudis could use oil as a weapon, American economic security was permanently hostage to their political decisions. His solution was to make Saudi economic interests and American economic interests structurally inseparable. The result was the petrodollar system, agreed in detail during Treasury Secretary William Simon's secret mission to Jeddah in July 1974. Saudi Arabia would price all its oil in U.S. dollars. The surplus revenue, the petrodollars, would be recycled into U.S. Treasury bonds and American financial markets. In return, the U.S. would provide security guarantees, arms sales, and diplomatic protection. The arrangement was kept secret for decades. Bloomberg only reported its full details in 2016, 42 years after it was made. But its effects were felt in every oil transaction on Earth from that day forward. The petrodollar system did something that no military alliance or treaty could achieve. It made Saudi Arabia structurally dependent on American financial stability, while making American financial stability structurally dependent on Saudi oil pricing. Neither side could weaponize the relationship without destroying what made the relationship valuable. It was the most elegant geopolitical lock ever constructed, and it held for 50 years. The cracks in it are only appearing now. We will cover that in episode 10. While America was building its Middle Eastern oil architecture, the Soviet Union was developing its own oil strategy, and it was fundamentally different. The Soviets didn't need Middle Eastern oil. They had Siberia. The discovery and development of the West Siberian oil basin from the 1960s onward gave the Soviet Union enormous petroleum reserves, eventually making it one of the two largest oil producers on Earth, alongside the United States. Soviet oil didn't flow to Western markets. It flowed to Soviet client states and Warsaw Pact allies, and the revenue it generated funded the arms race. The Soviet oil weapon operated differently from the American one, where America used oil access as a carrot, offering security in exchange for supply. The Soviets used oil supply as a subsidy and a leash. Warsaw Pact countries received Soviet oil at below-market prices. This kept them economically dependent on Moscow and politically compliant. When a satellite state showed signs of independence, one of the tools Moscow had was the threat of pricing its oil at world market rates, which those economies could not afford. The oil subsidy was both a gift and a chain. The Soviet oil revenues also funded something the Western public rarely understood: the arms buildup. During the 1970s, the decade of oil price shocks, Soviet hard currency earnings from oil exports to Western Europe surged. These earnings purchased the technology, grain imports, and industrial equipment that kept the Soviet system functioning. They also funded the military expansion that kept NATO on high alert throughout the decade. The Carter administration understood this connection explicitly. The Carter Doctrine of 1980, declaring the Persian Gulf a vital American interest worth fighting for, was partly a response to Soviet oil revenue and the military power it was buying. The Soviet oil strategy had one fatal flaw that the American strategy did not: it was entirely dependent on oil price. When oil was expensive, as it was through most of the 1970s, Soviet hard currency earnings were sufficient to fund the system. When Ronald Reagan, in coordination with Saudi Arabia, engineered a dramatic fall in oil prices in the mid-1980s, the effect on the Soviet economy was catastrophic. Soviet hard currency earnings collapsed. The subsidies to Eastern European client states became unsustainable. The arms race became unaffordable. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 had many causes. One of them was the oil price. The oil price collapse of 1985-86 is one of the most underappreciated events in Cold War history. Saudi Arabia increased production dramatically, flooding the market, crashing the price from over $30 per barrel to under 10. Whether this was a deliberate coordinated strategy with Washington or a convergence of interests remains debated by historians. What is not debated is the effect. The Soviet economy lost roughly half its hard currency earnings in less than 2 years. The system it was funding began to fail. 4 years later, the wall came down. The Cold War in the Middle East was not fought only through economic instruments. It was fought through proxy wars, and the most consequential proxy conflict of the era was the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. Iran had just produced the Islamic Revolution, removing the Shah, America's key regional ally, and replacing him with an anti-American theocracy. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was a secular Arab nationalist state that had been drifting toward the Soviet orbit. When Saddam invaded Iran in September 1980, the Reagan administration's response revealed the full depth of its oil-driven strategic logic. It quietly supported both sides at different times, but ultimately backed Iraq, because an Iranian victory would give a hostile theocracy control over the Persian Gulf. American support for Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War is one of the most documented and least discussed episodes of Cold War history. The U.S. provided Saddam Hussein with satellite intelligence showing Iranian troop positions. It extended agricultural credits that freed up Iraqi resources for weapons procurement. It provided diplomatic cover when Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians, events that were documented at the time and reported to Congress. The same Saddam Hussein who would be called a monster in 1990 was being called a strategic partner in 1986. Oil and geopolitics had determined the characterization, not the conduct. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years, killed over 1 million people, and ended in a stalemate that resolved nothing. Iraq emerged from the war deeply in debt, primarily to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who had financed the Iraqi war effort as a bulwark against Iranian expansion. Saddam Hussein's demand that Kuwait forgive that debt, and Kuwait's refusal, was the direct trigger for the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. The Gulf War, which the entire world watched on CNN, grew directly from the financial wreckage of the Iran-Iraq War, which grew from the Islamic Revolution, which grew from the 1953 coup. Pull the thread. The Gulf War of 1991 Operation Desert Storm was the first major post-Cold War test of American military supremacy. It was also the clearest demonstration of the Carter Doctrine in action. The United States would use military force to prevent any hostile power from controlling Persian Gulf oil. The coalition assembled by George H.W. Bush expelled Iraq from Kuwait in 100 hours of ground combat. The decision to stop at the Iraqi border and not march to Baghdad was deliberate. The strategic goal was not regime change. It was oil supply restoration. Saddam stayed in power. The oil flowed. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Middle East remained. American military presence in the Gulf, established under Carter, expanded under Reagan, deployed under Bush Sr., remained under Clinton, and became the permanent architecture of American power in the region. The bases built to fight the Cold War became the bases used to fight the war on terror. The oil dependency that created them had not ended. It had deepened, and the man who would eventually challenge both the dependency and the architecture was sitting in a cave in Afghanistan in 1996. And his name was Osama bin Laden. The Cold War oil architecture produced something that its architects did not intend and could not have predicted. It made the United States so deeply embedded in the Middle East that it became the target of the very instability it was trying to manage. The bases that protected Saudi oil generated the grievance that motivated al-Qaeda. The weapons sold to Middle Eastern governments armed the militias that would later oppose American forces. The coups and the proxy wars and the strategic partnerships created a region where anti-American sentiment was not the exception. It was the structural output of decades of policy. Not because the policy was evil, because it was consistent. What this episode has traced is the architecture of American global power, built in the Middle East, funded by oil, maintained through a combination of military presence, intelligence operations, and financial interdependence. That architecture was not built by accident. It was designed, piece by piece, by men who understood exactly what they were doing. Roosevelt on the Quincy, Eisenhower authorizing Ajax, Kissinger constructing the petrodollar, Reagan and the oil price weapon against Moscow. Each piece was deliberate. Together, they built a system that ran the world for 50 years. And in episode 5, we show you the moment that system almost broke, in October 1973, when Arab oil ministers deployed the weapon the Seven Sisters had used against them, and stopped the Western world in its tracks. This is episode 4 of our series on oil and world power. We have now traced the thread from the original oil war of WWII through the construction of the Cold War oil architecture, and up to the moment in 1990, when that architecture faced its first post-Cold War test in the Gulf. In episode 5, the 1973 oil embargo, we go inside the most consequential oil crisis in history. The moment OPEC found its voice, the dollar's relationship with oil was permanently restructured, and the Western world discovered that its prosperity was sitting on a foundation it did not control. That episode changes how you understand every energy price spike, every Middle East crisis, and every U.S. foreign policy decision you have ever read about. If this episode gave you a new framework for understanding why the Cold War looked the way it did, why America was in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf, in all of it simultaneously, then you understand something that most foreign policy analysis leaves out. It was never primarily about democracy or communism. It was about the oil underneath the ground and who got to decide how it moved. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. In episode 5, we are going to sit inside the 1973 embargo, the single most consequential week in the modern history of energy, and watch the entire post-war order shake. You do not want to miss what comes next.